Turning our attention to part one, let's talk for a little bit about technique. It certainly has been said that sometimes ideas are cheap, but only the person with the adequate technique will be able to express the ideas, and I think there's some truth in that. So technique is never an end in itself. It's always more important to be trying to be as musical as you can possibly be. But certainly having ample technique facilitates our expression in jazz performance, to be sure. With regard to the guitar and technique, starting with the right hand, and I would like to talk just about the right hand for a little bit. I like to rest my little finger against the hand rest, the outer part of my little finger against the hand rest. Most people call it a pick guard. I like to refer to it as a hand rest because that's what it is for me. This place where I can anchor my little finger, not rigidly, but nonetheless anchor it. The first of the three techniques that we'll talk about would be strict alternate picking. And some of the leading exponents of that type of technique say that you should play from the elbow. I've never felt comfortable with that, and so I do it from the wrist and with my little finger resting against the hand rest, like so. I might just play what I might think of as eighth notes on the six strings here. So it's the wrist action that you're seeing. So that type of technique certainly gives you power with your right hand, but the second kind of technique that I'd like to talk about is what is referred to, or has been referred to for the longest time, as consecutive picking, where you play two downstrokes in a row or two upstrokes in a row. And the idea behind consecutive picking is that when you're moving from a sixth to first string direction, the first stroke is always a downstroke as you're going this way. And when you're moving in a first to sixth string direction, the first stroke is always an upstroke. So if you were playing, say, a tremolo like I was playing before, I might do it starting with an upstroke. But see, I'm doing it with just my index finger and my thumb. And so when I'm playing upstrokes, my index finger pivots slightly and my thumb relaxes. On the other hand, when I'm playing in a sixth to first string direction, my index finger relaxes and my thumb does the work of playing. And incidentally, the downstrokes here are rest strokes, where I'm bringing the pick to rest on the adjacent higher or lower string. So that would be typical of doing that with consecutive picking. So again, to repeat, when I'm playing in a first to sixth string direction, most of the upstrokes are going to be rest strokes and the downstrokes free. When I'm playing in a sixth to first string direction, the downstrokes are rest strokes and the upstrokes are free. However, a very good exercise to develop that sort of technique is to sometimes play all rest strokes with just the inside four strings, that is from second to fifth string. So here, sounds like I'm over-enunciating. Sounds like I'm playing a little too loud. but it really helps to develop that feeling of being able to play a rest stroke at a split second if you need to, and in either direction. So if I'm, and you can hear the pronounced, the pronounced sort of sound that produces. Now, at the same time, it's a good idea to do that same sort of exercise, but with free strokes. That is, where you don't come to rest on the adjacent string, so that when you do use free strokes, they're not anemic compared to a rest stroke. So here, these are the same exercise. This is the same exercise with just free stroke. You can hear that the sound is not so pronounced, but it would still be ample when need be. Now at this point it might be a good idea to bring the left hand into the picture. I'm going to return for a moment and just play a C major scale, what I refer to as across the strings, that is from a sixth to a first string direction. And if I play the scale with alternate picking, you hear this typical push-pull sound, which probably all of us have learned at one point or another. Now the difference in the sound and the technique when you're using consecutive picking is that, and I'll try to talk and play here if I can, I'm picking down, up, down, up, down, down, up, down, down, up, down, down, up, down, up, and then the descending part of the scale, down, up, up, down, up, down, up, up, down, up, up, down, up, up, down. So the difference, if I play the consecutive picking just a little faster, you can hear that that push-pull sound is not necessarily a characteristic. That's the sound of the consecutive picking. Now, the third type of picking that we hear in jazz guitar performance is what I think a lot of us refer to as legato picking, where you're doing a lot of hammer-ons and pull-offs. And so when you're doing something of that sort, now it, of necessity, involves the left hand, because if you're trying to be deliberate about which notes you slur with a hammer-on or a pull-off, you have to not only be concerned about what you're doing with your right hand, but also the notes that you're playing and how they're distributed with the left. And so here, if I'm playing just, say, a D major scale, and so now here in this case with a little bit of a swing inflection, notice how I was hammering on and incidentally into the upbeat in order to create that swing kind of an inflection. So in most cases when you're playing that legato picking, the strokes from the right hand are mostly rest strokes, because you want the fullest stroke that accommodates maybe 2, even 3 notes if need be. Now on the other hand, you could also be using, say, legato kind of picking if you were slurring, say, into the upbeat as you do in an even 8th note sound. you can hear that sort of a sound. And so that also is a reflection of legato picking, where you play a lot of slurs with hammer-ons and pull-offs. So those are the three main techniques that I use, and I think that are fairly commonplace among jazz guitarists. I guess my preference, because I'm trying to get as much of a horn-like, or as it were a vocal-like sort of a sound, I guess the legato picking is something that I tend to favor a lot because of that, having played a lot with horn players where you're trying to phrase together. So those are the three picking techniques from the right hand, but now let's turn our attention to the left. And there's an exercise that I was given by my mentor, Dennis Sandoli, years ago, and he referred to this exercise as finger gymnastics. And so I suppose the reason that he called it that is that you alternate each finger with every other finger. And now I can use all three of those right-hand techniques that I was talking about, alternate, consecutive, or legato picking, with the exercise. I'll start with the alternate picking so that you can see the sequence of the fingering in the left hand. And you can start either on the first string and head in the direction of the sixth, or vice versa. But that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the first string and alternate my first and second finger. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to achieve is to get as long a sound, even though I'm attacking all of the notes now here as I use alternate picking, I'm trying to get as long a sound out of each note, because the guitar, as we all know, by nature is sort of a percussive instrument. And so if you don't pay attention to trying to get the full length out of each note, you could the sound could become very dry. So as I'm playing now first to second finger across, I'm trying to let one finger follow the other, so to speak, so that I get the full value. So anyway, the exercise looks like this, and I'm using alternate picking to begin with my right hand. Can you see what I'm saying with my finger? See? My second finger is following my first. Now if I reverse that, now my first finger is following the second, so that I get as long a possible sound as I can get. Now I'll continue with the strict alternate picking here, just so that you get the idea of the finger sequence. First I went first to second, then second to first, then moving along a little bit. Here's first to third, with that same sort of thinking of letting one finger follow the other. So this is 3 to 1. That is third finger to first finger. Now first to fourth finger, and then fourth to first. So my first finger is following my fourth now. Now second to third finger, and then third to second, and always with that same idea in mind, that one finger is following the other. And then second to fourth. And then fourth to second. And then finally the last two, third to fourth. And then finally fourth to third. So that's the sequence of the left hand. each finger being alternated with every other finger. Oh, one thing that I didn't mention is the placement of the thumb. I like to place the thumb in such a way that it's positioned so that all fingers receive the support of the thumb. So roughly speaking, it's maybe on the opposite side of my second finger, or maybe a little bit toward the first finger, but anyway, that's the position of my thumb. And I suppose you could say, if I turn you could see it like so. Now, everything I was doing then with that gymnastic exercise so far involved doing it with strict alternate picking. Now, I was saying before, you can practice all three, so let's start again, and this time, if I'm using consecutive picking, again to repeat the principles of consecutive picking, as you're moving in the first to sixth string direction, the first stroke is always going to be an upstroke. When you're moving from a sixth to first string direction, the first stroke is always going to be a downstroke. So now I might start down, up, but now as I go to the second string, it's up, down, and the upstrokes are rest strokes and the downstrokes are free. Now I might repeat that, but now as I go to the fifth string, the downstroke is a rest stroke and the upstroke is free. And that's sort of typical of the consecutive picking. Now as I return down, up, down, up, down, then up, down, up. So I'm changing, now here's first to string, first to third, and as I make that move, I'm always making the changes from down, up to up, down, and so on the fifth and second string. Anyway, you can hear that slight difference in the sound because it doesn't have quite the push-pull, and so that's the consecutive picking technique employed with this fingering. So I think you get the idea of the difference between the two. Now, as we mentioned, then what about legato picking? Well, again, if I go back to playing the first finger to the second finger, now I can practice my hammer-ons, and maybe a subtle but necessary technique in getting good hammer-ons and pull-offs is to make sure that the note that you're leaving, you still apply pressure to. So if I'm playing from this F to this F sharp, as I'm hammering onto the F sharp, I'm always making sure that I'm always keeping the pressure on with both. Now here with the pull-off, I have to anticipate the note that I'm playing, that I'm pulling off to, so that that's in position in ample time to get a good clear sound. And incidentally, with my right hand, everything are all rest strokes. But again, notice how my first finger stays put on the first fret as I'm putting my third finger down. And then here as I'm playing 3 to 1, I'm trying to anticipate that note that I'm pulling off to. Now here, I'm still thinking about one finger following the other, even though we're using, slurs, hammer-ons and pull-offs. So anyway, you get the idea with being able to do that with legato picking. Incidentally, it might be worth mentioning too that there are three kinds of pull-offs that you get. I'll just go to wherever on the fingerboard. One is where when you, with regard to your right hand, you just almost go straight up, so that it's a very light sound, but it's still a pull-off, it's still a downward slur. And then another stroke that you use with your right hand with a downward slur is to, your right hand is the same, excuse me, but it's with regard to your left hand, the pull-off, in this case my third finger slams into the adjacent higher string, see? And you almost get like a picking sound from the finger as it pulls off in a very hard kind of a way. And then the one that we use probably the majority of the time is where when you pull off, your third finger just sort of brushes the next, the adjacent higher string, like so. See, my third finger is brushing against the third string here, and you hear that. You hear that sort of a sound typically when you're hearing the most frequently heard pull-off, as it were, in legato picking. Now, one thing that I'll sometimes do, and I might use any of the three picking techniques, just strict alternate or probably, I use a lot of consecutive picking and legato picking, so I'll probably do this with some consecutive picking. But in order to get a workout all over the fingerboard, since obviously that's one challenge that the guitar, well, any stringed instrument offers, is that the notes get closer together the closer you get to the sound box. So sometimes I might start and go from my first finger to my second finger, but then go up a fret to come back, and then each time I change the fingering, I move, so that I'm getting, in so doing, I work my way up the fingerboard. So you can see that the finger action is the same, except that every time I make a change, I'm moving, and then so that's a way of getting a little bit more mileage out of the finger gymnastics exercise, to move it all the way up the board. Another thing that could be done, which is beneficial, is to sometimes, in doing the finger gymnastics, play the first string to the third string to the fifth string, and then return 6, 4, 2, and then as you switch, so you're skipping strings, and then and you can also do that same thing where maybe you're picking the first string and the fourth and the sixth and then the fifth and the third and the first. So the whole point of it is that you're giving your both hands a workout. And one thing about technique exercises, your concentration is on the how, not necessarily the what, because the moment that we start getting involved with um, a certain tool, you might say, like playing a scale, then you should be paying attention to the actual notes per se. And admittedly, when I was doing those different technique exercises, I was thinking a lot about how my fingers were responding in either hand, and I wasn't paying as strict attention to each individual note. Oh, I could see the notes that I was playing, and if I stopped and looked, I could tell you what note I was playing at any point. But the thing is, with technique exercises, that's what you're concentrating on. How are you playing, and what sort of a sound are you producing? So, in review of some technique exercises, it's a good idea to do some just right hand exercises as well as putting both hands together. There is maybe one last exercise. I'll return to some open string exercises that might be helpful to consider. And sometimes, now, and in this case I'm doing it with consecutive picking, I might think of a certain tempo. You could use the metronome if you wanted, but I might be saying to myself, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 2 and so I'm combining every pair of strings. So the tempo is fairly slow, and now I'm coming back, and now the 4th and 5th, and the 3rd and the 4th, and the 2nd and the 3rd, and the 1st and the 2nd. So that's eighth notes with consecutive picking. It is essentially a consecutive picking type of exercise, but very beneficial for thinking about following those principles of making sure the first stroke in a first sixth string direction is an upstroke, and in a sixth to first string direction that the first stroke is a downstroke. Now, but at the same tempo, I might think of playing eighth note triplets. So I'm keeping time. Like I say, you could turn the metronome. So, but see, so it certainly would be thought of as being consecutive picking, in as much as I'm picking 3 upstrokes in a row and then 3 downstrokes in a row. Okay, at that same tempo, you could think 16th notes, like 1 E. So now you get the benefit of just working with your right hand alone, but keeping time, like I'm saying, set the metronome, let it be at the same tempo, and go from eighth notes to eighth note triplets to 16th notes just on open strings, and see how your right hand feels. For me, I was always maintaining contact with my little finger, that outside part of my little finger with the hand rest, and it becomes sort of like radar, or maybe a reference point. Obviously, that's what I was thinking of it as. So those are certainly some things that are helpful to me. Sometimes I'll use them as warm-up exercises, and just to get my hands moving, whether I'm going to do some practicing or a little teaching, or even when you go out on a gig, you know, you're to warm up, I might go off in the corner and do some finger gymnastics for a while to loosen up. So, as time goes on, we'll talk about some other techniques that are helpful, but again, one more time for the review: the strict alternate, which comes from the wrist, and then the consecutive picking, which essentially comes from the thumb and the index finger, where you start with the pick perpendicular to the string and with a very slight altering of the position of the pick as you make a downstroke, so that you feel as if the stroke that you're making is not so much hitting the string as just pushing your pick through the string with the downstroke, as well as the upstroke. It's still perpendicular to start with, but then you pivot the pick just slightly in order to make a follow through. And I'm especially thinking about when you play rest strokes. So that would be another thing to think about with regard to both consecutive picking and legato picking, that you're pushing the strings around instead of hitting them. I think that's a good way of thinking about what you're doing with your right hand. Well, in my introductory comments, I was saying that sometimes with part one we can include technique and some ear training and some reading. So let's just talk briefly here in this part one about some ear training. To begin with, why is ear training so important? Well, in many ways you will not play what you do not hear. And in the case of our instrument, we're doing a lot of accompanying, and we want to be able to hear that person that's doing the soloing and be able to accompany in an appropriate way. So, and this is somewhat conventional, that the first place that you start with ear training are with intervals. And so a thing that's helped me, a process that quite frankly I can't remember where I first heard about it, but it really works well, is to think of a certain interval. And I'll take the interval of a fifth. Now, I'm going to play the C on the bottom here, and then G on the top. And so sometimes the low note that you're using and then singing a note higher than it, the low note is sometimes referred to as the standard. So in this case, the C would be the standard, and then from it you could play seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, whatever. But I'm just going to choose an interval here to make a suggestion. Just hypothetically, supposing you're having a little trouble distinguishing accurately the difference between hearing a perfect fourth and hearing a perfect fifth, and so you want to try to improve on that. One of the things that you can do, as I was saying, is to just repeat this interval so that the only thing you're hearing is a perfect fifth. And then at some point, as you're playing that, begin to sing with it. And you can sing the notes. You can say C, G, C, G, or la, 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 la. Pardon my voice. It resembles a tugboat in a New York harbor, I'm afraid. But the whole point is to be able to sing the note as you're playing. C, G, C, G, C, G, C, G. Now, at some point, you stop playing and just keep singing. C, G, C, G, C, G, C, G. And so you keep that up for a while. C, G, C, G. And then you bring the playing back. C, keep singing. C, G, C, G, C. And then you stop the singing, but you keep the playing. C. So, it's a way of being able to get, allow your tonal memory to really hone in on a certain interval. And now notice that I think the mistake that all of us make is that sometimes we're premature in trying to test ourselves out as to whether we've heard the interval, and we allow incorrect performances, the wrong, that we're inaccurate with our trying to sing an interval, so that we have incorrect performances, as it were, competing with correct performances, and so we try to eliminate that. And so that method that I was just suggesting, I think works very well. I just arbitrarily chose a fifth. It could be, you could be do the same thing with a sixth. Just C, A, C, A, C, A. One other thing about ear training that I think has become a tried and true method is that if, as a youngster perhaps, we learned a lot of little ditties, were wonderfully made, and our brains will sometimes retain that tonal memory. And so in trying to remember certain intervals, if you can think about just some of those simple things that you learned in the past, they help you to remember the interval. For example, if I play that standard C again, and I want to think of fourth, here comes the bride. See, and then, or maybe I want to sing a sixth, and so I say, my blonde, pardon my voice, my bonnie lies, my blonde. See, so that's a sixth, and so on. Or maybe just even something simple like a second from The Sound of Music. Do, ah, dear, ah, fee, do, ah. But anyway, a suggestion is to just think of some of those little ditties that you may have learned in the past and use them. Obviously, locate what the interval is. One thing not to do with that helpful device is to learn a new song in order to learn how to sing a certain interval. That's backwards. It's got to already be there and you tap into it. For example, I'm sometimes there's a song I learned a long time ago called I'll Close My Eyes. And so if I want to sing a minor seventh, I'll close my eyes, I'll close. See, there it is, see? And so I can bring that. But now, if somebody said, oh, so in order to learn a seventh, I have to learn, I'll close my eyes. No. That doesn't work. You must have something that's already there that you can tap into. And so you say, well, I don't know how many of those I can remember. Well, take a sheet of paper and write down just intervals within an octave, minor second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, and so on up to an octave, and see if you can remember certain little like little ditties, and especially the opening notes. Another little caveat, I suppose, about this sort of thing. If somebody said, oh, there's a diminished fifth right in the middle of this complicated bebop figure, like right in the middle of anthropology, you got a certain interval or something. You'd have to play halfway through the song to find the interval. That's not a way to do it either. It's preferably those opening notes of the song that you can bring to mind, and a simple song. Those are things that kind of help with ear training. And certainly we'll talk more about ear training as we go on, but let's change directions now and finish up our part one here with talking just a little bit about reading. And I'm sure I don't have to mention this to many guitar players, but we as an instrumental family by and large, do not enjoy a good reputation as sight readers. Now, there's a difference between taking a piece of music that we want to learn and taking it home, going into our studio and working on it diligently until we finally put it all together. And that's a good thing to do. We learn from doing that, and if it's somebody that inspired us, we can see if we can play it and imitate the way they played it, and the music was helpful in the process. But that's different than sight reading. Sight reading implies just that. Somebody puts a piece of music in front of you and says, play it right now. And maybe you have maybe 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes or something to look it over before you start, or maybe even, hopefully, 4 or 5 minutes. That would even be better. Sometimes you don't have very much time and you're trying to read what's there. If maybe the first thing is to just look over, don't look at just the first few notes. Look at the entire page. Look at everything that's there. And here are some obvious things that we need to certainly be taking into account. What's the key signature? What's the time signature? Are there any accidentals that are in the piece that you're being asked to sight read? And those accidentals may represent a change of key. Maybe not an actual change of the key signature itself, but as you're playing, your ear tells you that you've switched, there's a transition to another tonal center besides the initial one. So that's important. Sometimes we would want to look at the rhythms. And a good idea with regard to rhythms might be to just tap out the rhythms on the side of your guitar. Maybe hum as you, and so you're seeing this rhythm, do-bop, ba-do-bop, 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 and I'll play off my foot all of the time. If I'm thinking about that rhythm, I want to make sure that my foot is giving me, at a slower tempo, all 4 beats in the measure, and maybe when the tempo gets up, I might just eliminate the 2 and the 4 and just tap on 1 and 3, so that I'm always feeling the strong beats of the measure, but then I'm playing those rhythms against my foot to see if I'm coming into the right place. So here, the rhythms don't involve the actual pitches. They just, you isolate out just the one item that's so necessary, the rhythms themselves. Then another thing that you might do is to take a look at the pitch sequence that's there and maybe put your fingers on the fingerboard without even using your right hand. Just see if, and don't think about the rhythmic units, the note values. Just think about the note sequence and see what the fingering feels like as you're going to play those notes. And then do that maybe in several places that you feel might be a little tricky in the process of trying to play. Then obviously you would look at the articulations, that tell you about playing short or long notes or whatever. Maybe you would also, the subject of phrasing that we were just alluding to a little bit when we were talking about legato picking, you'd want to take into account, any and all articulations and phrasing markings. Also, dynamic markings. You can take a look at crescendos and decrescendos, diminuendos, or whatever. Expressions that have to do with the volume level that you're playing at. And then, certainly, as you think about playing through it, see if you can do that. I mean, if you're practicing at home and you put some new piece of music in front of you, see if you can play from the upper left to the bottom right without stopping. Maybe sometimes that seems difficult. You feel like your batting average is less than 50%, and so that kind of stops you in your tracks. You just say, wait a while, I better try something a little easier, and that would be understandable. But when you have played something through where you feel like you can play it from the upper left to the bottom right, notice the trouble spots. Okay, that the second measure, third line, boy, that was really tricky, but I kept going anyway and didn't lose my place. And then you get to the maybe the bottom line, that second to the last measure. I seem to not play that very well or very accurately. Well, then go back to the trouble spots, clean them up, see if you can say, okay, this is how that should sound, this and this and this. And then, after you've cleaned up the trouble spots, maybe go back to the upper left and try reading it through one more time without stopping. However, after you've done that, then move on to the next one. Don't keep practicing that same piece over and over again, or it loses its value as a sight reading experience. And that's what you want. You want to have the value of sight reading. And so it might seem strange, and it might seem even difficult to play and say, well, boy, I'd like to play everything perfectly, but you're not playing everything perfectly, but at least you're learning to do something that's very valuable. You keep the music going, and so you've played this first etude or whatever it is that you're sight reading twice through, 3 times at the most, and then you're going on and trying the same process with the next one. And again, we'll talk about sight reading as we go. One last thing about sight reading that is worth considering. Supposing, just to set up a hypothetical kind of situation, supposing there's a tenor saxophonist that's putting a group together, and he's written the arrangements, maybe some original songs, or maybe some standards from the jazz repertoire, but he's written some arrangements that include guitar. And so now he's trying to decide who that guitarist might be. Maybe there's some guitarist who is a wizard, he can play up and down the fingerboard at 90 miles an hour, but he cannot read very well. And then maybe there's another person whose reading is quite good, but he doesn't have much of a feeling for improvisation. And then the third guy, whose reading is pretty good. Certainly the saxophone player might think it adequate, because if he gives him the music ahead of time and he can work on it. And then he's also a pretty good soloist. So of those 3 people, it's interesting that the flashiest of the 3, he gets eliminated first because he can't read. And then that second person who reads very well, they're kind of stiff and doesn't feel as though he has much of a feel for improvisation. So don't you know, that third person is probably the one the tenor saxophonist is going to hire. And my whole point is, it was the reading, his ability to read, that made him, that's what appealed to the saxophone player to include him. So anyway, just a few points about technique and about ear training and about reading in our part 1.